Welcome to the Election Whisperer, and I am ecstatic because I have finally hooked up with Zerlina Maxwell, one of my personal sheroes, because she, like me, is out there every day trying to convince people it's not 1992 still, it's 2020, and the electorate has changed, and there's these people called Gen Z and millennial voters, and they don't think the same way. That's why when Black Lives Matter protests broke out all across America, people like them better, not worse. Okay, so I'm so excited because Zerlina has put out this new book, and it's got this great provocative title, ballsy like me and her, and it's called The End of White Politics. And the reason, of course, for that title is that our political system, the decision makers, the campaigns, the strategy, dominated by the white paradigm. And so we're going to talk about this book, this thesis, this argument. I'm so excited to have her on the show today. Welcome, Zerlina. Now, you are also, if I am correct, the in charge of all the progressive radio content on Sirius. Can you tell us a little bit about that role?
Yeah, so I'm the Senior Director of Progressive Programming for Sirius XM. I run alongside Tim Johnson, the Sirius XM Progress channel. That's channel 127. And I've done that since pretty much the inauguration of Donald Trump. I started in February of 2017. And since then have added talent like Dino Badaya and Jorge Olivares. We just added John Fugelsang. And so, I think what we've done since 2017 is be a go-to place. If you don't have Sirius, you can get a free trial in the app. And so you can listen to progressive content all day long. Obviously we get our share of elected officials and presidential candidates when it was the primary. But really we just try to be a two-way conversation between the progressive base and media folks who are really engaged. Me and my co-host, we host the morning show. It's the only feminist morning show in America.
Awesome.
And I think it's a really intelligent conversation between a Black feminist and a white feminist about progressive politics. So if that sounds like something that would be interesting to you, and also because you understand that feminists can be funny, so I find our show very entertaining in that way too. It might be a place for you. So I think the role at SiriusXM post 2016 campaign allowed me to channel my rage and anger and disappointment into something productive. And so what I feel like we built out in terms of the progressive content at Sirius is a diverse array of perspectives and lived experiences that I think, it fed perfectly into what I talk about in The End of White Politics, which is that, the country it's not just all about white people. And until we just admit that and move forward, we may never be able to reach our fullest potential, not as a movement or as a country.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not. And, the front of this program, before you came on, I kind of walked through, right, some data talking about the changing face of America, and I actually grounded that in why, too. It's really just got this major trigger component in terms of the polarization that we face, because it's a sad fact of human nature that when power structures are toppled, the people that had the power tend to not give it up willingly or fight it. And that doesn't mean everybody. I mean, obviously there's tons of white allies and plenty of people who are embracing change, but there are also people like Donald Trump who don't. And so but anyway, we're looking at a very different America than we had 50 years ago. A lot of greatness coming from that diversity, and it's a whole new ball game. But it does, I think, take a reset to understand, like, okay, I think you start this book. You talk about being at a Politicon, right, which is this Comic Con for politics nerds. Now, I have not had an opportunity yet to go. I wasn't cool enough to go my first year out in the field, and then of course this plague has disrupted things. But so I hope to go eventually. But you open this book with this parable of being at Politicon, and you're on event with a friend of mine, Sir Michael. Michael, right, who is moderating this panel, and emotions are high. This is right after the election, so you've got a crowd full of what we'd call Bernie bros, and they are you're trying to take your message of it ain't just all about white folks. And what happens to you, Zerlina?
I got booed pretty
Yeah.
aggressively. And it got pretty loud and intense. And I think, you know, I I got the spark for the book because it was the juxtaposition of the reaction to really what I was saying. All I was saying was that Black women and women of color writ large are the base of the Democratic Party. They win elections. Black women specifically vote at 6 times a rate higher than other groups of people, not just other groups of women, but other groups of people. And so it's important to understand that if you cannot craft a message that resonates directly with Black women, and in that moment, I was talking specifically about Bernie Sanders and what I saw as some of his shortcomings in that regard, then you can't win the nomination. So what I was saying was I was critiquing 2016 Bernie and saying, these were some of the places I think that he fell short. This is how I think he can improve and why. And I got booed. And I said in the moment, I don't think booing a Black woman who's telling you that
Right.
you need to learn how to speak to us is a winning strategy in the Democratic Party. Now, then we didn't know what we know now sitting here. I mean, Joe Biden is the nominee largely because he had strong support with older Black voters. And that's Black women. That's Black women that go to church, like all of my aunties, who showed up for Joe Biden.
That's
And
correct.
unless
Right.
you learn how to speak to us, and then also the different generations of Black people and Latinx people, then you're not going to win. And so the Politicon experience and getting booed in that moment, it illustrated to me that I needed to lay it all out for people. It wasn't as obvious to them as it was to me. And so I needed to explain. And so that's what I did in the end of White Politics. I took the data, which says, according to Pew, that by 2045, America is going to be a minority white vote. And so
Right.
I like to frame it this way because, I think that makes it more clear than perhaps the way you probably heard it, which is America will be a majority minority country by 2045.
Yeah, right.
Doesn't mean anything, right? That doesn't actually tell you what's really happening. What it means is Black and brown people will be the majority, white people will be the minority of the electorate. That's what it means. White will be the minority, not majority minority. Say white will be a minority. You can say it, it's okay, it's fine. It
Right.
just means that that's going to have a transformational shift, I think, in not just who we put in positions of power in terms of representation and lived experiences, but also who puts people in power, the electorate that propels them to those positions. And so I think that a diverse electorate is going to want to see themselves reflected back and their experiences reflected back, because that means there's better policy outcomes.
That's exactly right. So, coming from my end of this experience, I started giving public lectures on voting behavior and political behavior, voting outcomes, polling stuff, here in Virginia. And I was reasonably surprised to find out that there's a big chunk, especially within the Democratic Party. I mean, it would be less surprising in a more general audience, but even here within the Democratic Party, how there's a lack of understanding of how important that descriptive representation component is. And it's not like, I mean, yes, it's true that in 20 some odd more years we'll hit this benchmark of majority minority, or white people will be a minority. But the fact is, like, we're already a very diverse nation, and in terms of the Democratic Party, this is an extremely diverse party. In the state of Georgia, in the 2008 election, African Americans cast the majority of ballots cast for Democrats in Georgia. Okay, so we're already talking about a very diverse party, and it baffled me when I started to do research on the two parties and in Democrats, just how poor the candidate recruitment in terms of descriptive representation really is. I mean, it's true that Democrats have a much better reflection of diversity than the Republicans, because I know somebody watching this is already typing to me, "Oh, Dr. Bitecofer," and it's true. I mean, almost all of the diversity in Congress comes from the Democratic caucus, blah 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 blah. Granted, we're still only at a quarter of a female Congress, which means 75% of it is male, right? And we're only at two black, or two, or I think it's two right now, two African American, yeah, right, two senators, right? So let's, yeah, so three, right? Yeah, we should not. No, we should not. And so keeping in mind, yes, there's all the progress is sequestered on the Democratic side, but there's still a lack of real, effort. And when we look at these 2018 and 2020 races, you would think, especially out in the Southwest, you would want to be really trying to recruit Latino and Latina candidates. When you're looking at, Jamie Harrison it should not be so notable that they've recruited candidates like Raphael Warnock and in Georgia, and Jamie Harrison, because this is something that I think the party should have been doing a long time ago, right? And it is a product of this fear of what you call identity politics, right? In the field of political science, I think, more broadly speaking, I think of it as descriptive representation, right? This effort of putting people into office that, more broadly reflect, or more, proportionally reflect the body politic that it represents. And so, this is definitely, to me, something that Democrats need to be doing, talking, and actively, aggressively pursuing in forms of women, women of color in particular. And, I'm glad to see that, somebody's saying, hey, look, like, this is not something that, and, I think a big part of it that I'm really anxious to talk to you about is this perception of electability, right? And this intersection between, who is electable in the eyes of the Democratic Party machine, the D-Trip and the DNC and the DSCC, and maybe whether you think that's changing. So what do you think about that?
I think a couple things. I mean, I think the reason why the Democratic establishment is so reluctant to really fully embrace identity politics, which is the thesis of the book. We need to embrace it. I like the way that you describe it. I also like the way Stacey Abrams, so I'm not the only one saying this. Stacey Abrams is out front saying this as well. You should read her book, Our Time Is Now. And her book talks about more of the technical pieces, the mail-in voting access, absentee access, registration, the ways in which Republicans are trying to suppress the vote. And she describes identity politics this way. We had a conversation about it when we discussed her book on my radio show. And she said she sees it as, the flip side sort of I don't see color, right? If you think of it like, people are like, well, I don't see color. And that's supposed to be sound progressive. Well, not anymore, because I think people are hip to it now. But it's sort of the flip side of that. Stacey Abrams describes it as identity politics, meaning I see you.
Yeah.
And I see the fulsomeness of who you are,
yes,
and how the different aspects of your identity, how they contribute to better or worse outcomes in terms of your education, your socioeconomic status, your access to certain, elements of the social safety net, healthcare. And so I think when you see someone in their full humanity, then you're just better able to put forward solutions that actually work for them. Right. I think too often we were targeting policies towards, one segment of white voters, when that's not our base. And then we wonder why Black and brown voters aren't really that enthusiastic. We always say that well, Democrats need to lay out a plan and be in there. One of the ways in which you can lay out a plan is to look to the Stacey Abrams model, which is that you're not doing one broad message to everyone. Everyone doesn't need the same message. You need to tailor it to that community. And sometimes that means using surrogates and other voices from that community. So it's an exchange of ideas, and you have validators who can communicate
That's exactly
on your
right.
behalf, and that are always in communication with the people on the ground. And that's the way that you actually can effectively not only campaign, but govern, most importantly. And I think Democrats just need to get away with their obsession with white working class voters, because we don't even win them. We haven't won white voters since 1964. I wasn't even born, and I don't know why the party that I'm in, or who I've worked for in the past, is obsessed with a voting bloc that they haven't won in over 40 years. Or is it 50 years,
this
right?
is
It's 50
definitely
years.
this is definitely something that my I rant about all the time is, and I opened the show with this joke about it being 1992, and the reason is, like, there's a actual element of the electorate in the 80s and the 90s. There was this process going on in the electorate where you had regionally the power bases of the parties switching, the Southern realignment, and really like the Northern, kind of Rockefeller liberal Republicans were disappearing, right? And so you had the South moving from Democratic to Republican, even though conservatism remains kind of fixed, right? And so for a while you have this ideological flux of, a mix up of people within their parties, and you also had the Democrat. So we think about the Republican Party as a party that is, had a civil war and it's in a hot mess right now, and it's, falling apart. But in the 1960s, the Democratic Party, the coalitions literally fractured into two pieces. I mean, we had, not only did you have that Southern, segregationist, racist component drop out, but you also had neoconservatives who were in the party on the foreign policy end, drop out over Vietnam reactions. So, like, that was a party that was remaking itself in two different, very distinct and very powerful areas. And so, like, when you think about, like, Bill Clinton's platform in the 1990s, it was the product of two things. Number one, an electorate that was ideologically heterogeneous in terms of, liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, so that you could get a lot of party switching. And number two, a political party that was, notably struggling with its identity, with its coalition, with winning elections. So, his "I'm a different kind of Democrat" message was something that I guess you could argue he needed to be electorally viable. But the problem is, like, the Democrats kind of settled on that message and stuck with it, right, for forever. And what baffles me is, like, you, for one, it's one thing, but then you get to this point in the mid 2000s where the Republican Party starts to lose its mind, and it, people forget this, and George W. Bush had many, negative marks on his record. But when he ran in 2000, he ran on a platform of comprehensive immigration reform, with a pathway to citizenship. He ran on receptivity, at least, to renewing the assault weapons ban, which was going to expire on whichever person won the White House's watch. I mean, he ended up not doing it, but he was not militant against that renewal, right? And then the party gets this, like, sharp shift to the right, and it goes, like, through these two major lurches, right? So now we've basically got this party of extremism, and we've had it for a long time, but you've never heard the Democrats frame it as such, right? And yet, they are the victims of that frame constantly. So, like, if I wonder, if I ran a poll and I asked voters which party is more extreme, which party has a problem with extremism, if it wouldn't be that voters would identify Democrats as the party that struggles with that. When you've got a party that's running around voting no, and here in Virginia they voted no on a law that would take guns away from people who beat their wives, like, I mean, that's pretty extreme, right? So, I think, like, what we're really talking about is two patterns, right? You've got this coalition that has changed in age and diversity, racial diversity, and it deserves to be represented, right? You're talking to this electorate that doesn't exist anymore, as you have pointed out, because those voters vote for the other party. Okay, they might be retrievable, but certainly not under the platform. You're not going to go for a racist, culture war type platform to retrieve them with. The only way you could retrieve them would be some kind of economic populist message, and you know the party's not going to throw, you know, it's not going to go into nativism, Trumpism to go after white working class voters, right? So you don't want, in other words, you don't want white, you know, non-college educated whites if it's going to be racial and gender hostility that brings them on board, right? And why would you want them? And especially when you have this rising coalition of you know, diverse, educated. One of the strengths of the Republican Party through the 60s, 70s, and 80s was that they had college educated voters. Now the Democrats have these voters. You should be leaning into this and identity politics, as you call it, in Abrams, I think, in a positive way, kind of recapturing this word that has been turned into this, you know, derogatory word, you know, and recapturing and framing it in a positive light, actually is a great way to accomplish that, because in the world of college, you know, educated people, these are issues that they want to hear talked about. They want to hear issues for women. They want to hear issues for LGBTQ. They want to hear about issues, you know, for African American or Black women or Latino women, or you know, all of these different identity-based movements that have never had a voice in the body politic before, or have had a voice in a side room down a hallway in the basement. Now we want seats in the main chamber, right? And we don't want to have to raise our hand and ask for permission for them. We want to take those you know, those positions, and we're demanding them, right? So we want a party that facilitates that kind of you know, representation.
Well, I think the reaction to the squad, the four firsts, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, they all represent firsts in the Congress from 2018. And one of the things that Ayanna Pressley said to me in an interview is that the Democratic establishment was very critical of sort of her message, her look, the idea that she was even running against a longtime incumbent, the entire idea that she would go up against a quote unquote good Democrat who quote votes the right way. You know, who do you think you are doing that? And she got a lot of advice that she ignored, frankly. And I think part of the problem is that the infrastructure, what I mean by infrastructure, I mean the campaign, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the Senatorial Committee, which is the organization that is corresponding in the Senate, you know, and also the offshoot of Democratic consultants. They're not representative of the electorate, the Democratic electorate, the people who do that work, the people who run the, you know, the digital firms on both sides of the aisle, frankly, are usually white dudes. There's some white women, certainly, that I know specifically. But I would say that also needs a complete overhaul as well, which means that at a certain point, the party or people of color, you know, and Black people themselves are going to have to step up and say, I should go work on a campaign. I should go get that experience. If you're at home right now and you don't have anything to do, or you wanted to do something, you know, to get Trump out of the White House, there's a job for you somewhere in the country, virtually, where you can get experience on a campaign, and then imagine that on your resume. Presidential campaign. What did you do this summer? I worked on the presidential campaign. And so I think part of it is, you know, really on the ground, starting on the ground, creating that pipeline of people that will be able to run for office later. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez started as an intern, and so did Ayanna Pressley. And then Ayanna Pressley worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Ted Kennedy, and then ran for city council, and then up the ladder. But I think starting out working on the campaign side is a great way to get experience behind the scenes, and then decide whether or not you want to help your friend get elected down the road, or whether or not you want to run yourself. So I think, you know, the reason why the party infrastructure right now is reluctant to embrace identity politics and embrace that type of candidate recruitment that you spoke to, or even the idea that we should train and uplift people who have normally been marginalized from the process, is that they lose grip on their power and hold over the process. Because if there are fewer seats at the table, there are more seats for them because they're already at the table. And so I just feel like, part of it is more practical even than theoretical. We need Black and brown people working on campaigns so that they can get the experience that they can then take with them into future runs for office or supporting other young people running.
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the best pleasures of being a professor that taught behavior, campaigns, and elections in the subfield because, I mean, at least the way that I saw it, especially coming, as a person that didn't go to college till I was 24, was a single mom. When I did go, I really pushed my kids to do internships in campaigns because it is a way to bypass, frankly, a lot of the spoils system world. The political system in particular is very spoils system based. It's a network based system. So if you know people, you get a better internship. You get one of these nice internships in DC. If you have parents that can afford to pay for you to live in DC on a small unpaid internship or small stipend internship, then I mean I could never have done anything like that when I was in college because I was a single mom. So I really did push my students to do that, and I especially pushed my students, though they were few and far between at my particular university of diversity there, to do and take advantage of those. One thing I will say though, is that coming, I'm pretty good at putting myself in the perspective of other players, and coming from the party's perspective, when you have these, like, I think it's important to recognize when you have different types of races, right? So when you have a race or a district like AOCs, you've got one set of conditions that are pretty amenable to experimentation, to bringing in fresh talent, new people, blah 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 blah. And I think the entropy in those types of districts, especially urban districts in New York, it's going to be a far less big problem. Though of course she challenged this massive incumbent, and it probably didn't make her popular.
Well,
So,
I mean, to that point, I mean, even in one of the safest, bluest
right
districts, the party was still unwilling to allow someone younger and with new ideas to run. I mean, because the idea that Joe Crowley didn't even live in the district, the idea that Elliot Engel was in Maryland quarantined because he doesn't live in his district is representative of the fact that we need new leadership. And I'm sorry, but like having oh, well, you have seniority, so to do what? Right? I mean, like, what are you doing with your seniority?
Yeah, this is definitely why, like, even though it's not, political scientists don't love term limits as a reform idea, but it is really popular amongst the public because, that's why you have behavior. You're right, because you have behaviors, but so, from the party's perspective, though, from like, all right, you basically have two different types of districts. You've got 390 of them basically that they're non-competitive, and maybe somebody gets a primary once in a while, gets kicked out in some freak accident, but other than that you barely notice that they exist. But then you've got 40 of them, 50 of them every election that you have to defend in title situations like 2018 or 2010. These are very intense, and so, like, the one thing I do try to get people to understand, especially on the left or on the far right, or on the right, when I talk to people that are activists in the political right, is that from the party's perspective, there's actually only one equation that they're trying to solve at all times, and that is everything that they do is really not, it's not based on like protection of special interest or anything else. It's about, will this help me or hurt us hold on to the seat, right? But the problem is that they haven't modernized the thinking that helps or hurts them hold on to the seat, right? So like I actually call it the Jesus problem. So it's like the forgive them, Lord, they know not what they do problem, right? So like they think in order to hold on to a seat, their members should take a vote that gives Trump the authority to go into Detroit and use military force, right? Because otherwise, there's going to be an ad that's, marks Representative Smith as soft on terrorism or something like that, right? And that's not how, especially Democrats, they don't. I mean, there's a reason why that shit doesn't happen in the GOP, right? Like the Democrats just don't get like how voters think. Like,
Well, our voters,
Right,
especially,
right. Especially
our
our voters,
voters,
right? Yeah.
our voters are, we're different than Republican voters. And
No
one of
doubt.
the things I think a lot about when I think about our voters is the outdated idea that, we win the white vote and we need to just win back those voters that, voted for Obama and then flipped to Trump, and we assume they're white people. But we don't even talk about the voters that went from voting for Obama to staying on the sofa and staying home and not going. And there are more of them.
Yeah.
And so I don't understand. It's not like the white voters are worth more, unless maybe that's subconsciously,
Well, I mean, here's the real baffle. Here's the
think.
real baffle. Like in every
competitive place that that there's an election in, when you look at the distribution of the electorate, like the least populated group, like the least in number, is always Republicans, right? So it might be Democrats or independents is the plurality, but it's never Republicans, right? And so you would think if any group had to campaign in a posture that required getting the other party's voters, not independents, the other party's voters, the actual card carrying members of the opposition party, to vote for them, it would be the Republican voters, right? Because they're so few in number that they would need the opposition party to survive. Yet you never hear a Republican campaign operated in, you don't hear it talked about or operated in a way that says, we need to stick to the middle and make sure we can get Democrats to cross over and vote for us, right?
Right. And I also, even thinking back to 2016, I remember that being sort of a calculation. Trump is so awful that we'll be able to get some of those suburban white women. And I just never felt like that was gonna bear out. Like that was not going to happen, because white people are Republicans. The majority of white people are Republicans.
Here's the thing.
Here's the thing. There is a realignment happening, and it's on college education, and that's because, like, within society right now, we have two things behaviorally happening with American political behavior. We have polarization, which is a party thing, Republicans and Democrats, and then we have populism. And we have populism on the left and the right. And populism, the flavor on the left and the right are different in terms of, economics. I mean, they have some similar cross currents, but the one thing that they kind of share is a reject of expertise and science, like anti-vax, all of that stuff. And so but the anti-intellectualism is much sharper on the right now. So you have college education as a major indicator. Now, like, what I mean by that is to say, if I had polling data from there's these big political science surveys that we use, and I ran a model and I tried to say, okay, is being college educated a statistically significant predictor of voting for Democrats back in 2004, it would not have been.
Okay.
Right.
Starting, and really even in 2016, it doesn't quite flip, but it starts to show signs, because this is how I develop my forecasting work. By 2018, now it's a statistical predictor, right? So like, if that's how my whole forecast is built on, like, okay, where are these college educated voters? So when we think about like what's happening in the electorate, it's not white people, it's really actually, Zerlina, this is a huge point of why you are so correct about your argument. you cannot continue, Democrats, you cannot continue to ignore and take for granted communities of color. Yes, I will give that you could do that for a long time, and you did. But you cannot do that anymore, because now what we're starting to see is a pattern of behavior that college educated voters of color are continuing to do the things they've always done, which is vote for Democrats. But non college educated voters of color are being targeted by, they're getting nothing from Democrats, and they're getting targeted by the Trump campaign with suppression shit and misinformation and disinformation. And since they're getting nothing on the other side, we're starting to see mild erosion of support. Okay, so like, it is this education thing that matters a lot. And it would be lovely to get everybody college educated, right? So universal college education would be a great idea. Free college, free community college, getting people more educated so that they can, decipher misinformation and disinformation. They can understand, when somebody is spouting bullshit out of their mouth and actually not doing anything economically viable for them. But you have one party that is, willing and able and doing actively hunting, in a suppressive way against, self-interest, communities of color, institutionally suppressing their vote, which I think is what Stacey has done such a great job highlighting. But what I've been trying to get people to understand is that there's a behavioral suppression. Like, that's what the Death Star is designed to do. It's not, the whole Trump 2020 campaign is not it's not an addition machine, it's a subtraction machine, right? And it's coming after communities of color, and the Democrats need to be talking an affirmative message to communities of color. Right.
Well, in 2016, one of the things that frustrated me, and it's not really the campaign itself, it's more the subset of people who, they do data analytics. And so their job is to come in and say, this is what the focus group told us about this message or that message. This is working, this isn't working, this is the perception, of, this message or the candidate themselves. And one of the critical things I think is missing in some of the data is this idea that talking about voter suppression suppresses the vote. Because, and that sort of makes sense intuitively, right? So if you talk about voting is going to be difficult because this is what Republicans are doing to try to make it difficult for you to vote, maybe you as a human hears, and people said to the focus group, well, that makes me less likely to vote, right? So that was sort of the directive. And I, as a Black person with family who marched in Selma, was like, no, you tell me,
vote more.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think you have to sort of put common sense, overlay your data with common sense and human behavior, right? And history.
Oh my God, drives me Zerlina.
So I was like, I want to vote more.
I'm going to give you because you have this position of influence and power, so I'm going to give you a line that, you don't have to use it, but I would recommend that you do. To say in moments like this, the worst way to know what people want is to ask them directly.
That's true.
Because they have no idea what moves them, okay? They have no idea what moves them.
And Democrats love to ask, do you like negative ads? No, I do not. Okay, well, why do we have negative ads then?
Because they work.
Yeah, because they work, right? So like, it's just, I happen to know this for a fact because I got this leaked focus group in 2018, so to basically, we're not going to run any campaign messaging on Trump because the voters say they want the election to be more about Trump, more than just about Trump. And I'm like, of course they say that. Nobody's going to tell you I'm a base animal that,
right.
That at the end of the day,
Well, I always felt that the Democratic message should have, I think that there's certainly those in the media that always say, there's a lot of punditry that says, well, the Democrats just can't have an anti-Trump message. They have to lay out a vision.
Right.
Yeah, the vision is that we're not racist, we're not sexist, we're not homophobic, we're not Islamophobic, we're not authoritarian, we're not going to send nondescript troops into cities to guard property, when we're really just trying to suppress peaceful protests. I mean, that is a vision.
That
The
is a vision.
anti-Trump vision is a
Yes,
vision.
it is. It's a vision of America that doesn't suck, you know?
Right. It's pretty good before. I was not in quarantine.
I know.
You can lay it out.
I know, and it reminds me like of the vice presidential talk. You know, I've been enduring this for a couple of weeks, especially this last week. It's been getting heavier and heavier. And you know, if I had $1 for every time one of these white guys has told the interviewer, well, all that really matters is synergy. You know, Biden's looking for a Joe Biden. He wants a guy that he can get along with. I'm like, Joe Biden was selected because he was an old white guy. And Barack Obama was a young black dude, and he was the first black dude to ever run for president, and he needed to balance the ticket. It wasn't because they got along, dude. You know?
Right? Nobody even said that. No one said that. I mean, I'm glad that they get along.
Yeah, no shit, but it was an accident. It wasn't the reason he got selected.
Right.
You know? Oh
right.
My God.
Well, I think that we always think about sort of, you know, how someone will get along with Joe Biden.
No
like,
doubt.
I mean, I get that, right? The ultimate question is like, who can be president? That's what Joe Biden is asking. And that's
Yeah,
what
yeah,
every presidential candidate is asking when they're selecting a vice president. Can this person be president?
Yeah.
That's the question Joe Biden, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, he could not like the person, but then if that person is the most qualified of the options to be president, that's the person he's going to pick. I mean, I think that like whether or not he gets, I mean,
right.
Fact of the matter is the president and the vice president, they're like hanging out all the time. Like,
no doubt.
If you've seen The West Wing, like they have separate meetings. Like some of the things they do when they come together. But you know, that's why they have 2 planes, because they don't go anyway.
Right.
I just don't think that
also,
they need to be BFFs.
I mean, you know, it's not like,
okay, I'm not saying just any Joe Schmo can be president, because obviously, right? Obviously, that can't, you know? I mean, number one, like anyone could be better than the guy that we have now.
We only ask for qualifications when it's somebody that's not a white guy.
Oh,
3 months ago, very serious people with straight faces said that Pete Buttigieg could be the president.
That's what I'm saying.
So if
everybody on that list is ready to be president on day one. I mean, so like that's, I mean, you know.
Right. And so it was silly to me that 3 months ago, everybody in the media, let's just talk about the media, not even voters, in the media, seriously talking about Pete Buttigieg for president.
Now we're wondering if Kamala Harris is qualified, right?
Anybody that says that any of the women that are under consideration is not qualified, then they are just exposing themselves to have bias against women in positions of leadership.
No doubt. Which would make them pretty
At least we know who they are now.
Oh man, I could talk to you forever, but you know, we hit the hour mark, so I have to cut off.
It was so great. You know what? Let me show everybody your fabulous book. If you have enjoyed this last hour as much as I have, you need to pick up this book. It is a great book. It is Pure Zerlina on Fire, and you know, however many pages it is of Pure Zerlina. So get it from Amazon or your local book seller. And such a great, I can't wait to talk to you again.
Thank you. It's fun talking.
Yeah.